woods were deep and quiet in the way that only winter allows. Snow had fallen earlier, and not recently. It didn't cover the forest so much as settle into it, filling the dips between roots, smoothing over fallen logs, pressing gently against the bases of trees, like it was trying not to wake anything. There were no sharp lines here, no shadows with edges. The trees stood without movement, tall, mostly bare, though some wore patches of lichen like forgotten badges. Their branches reached up in thin, patient angles, holding nothing. The sky above was pale, not cloudless, not bright, just a color between colors, as if the day itself hadn't yet decided what kind of morning it wanted to be. Pine passed through the upper trees occasionally, but it wasn't strong, just enough to stir the tops and whisper low along the snowpack. You could almost hear it rearranging the silence. The sound didn't travel far. Everything in the woods seemed to keep its voice close, like it was trying not to interrupt. Between the trees, snow lay uneven. In some places, it drifted high against fallen branches or gentle slopes. In others, it had thinned to reveal dark, damp earth beneath, patches of brown and grey where some warm-blooded thing had passed or pressed its weight. No footprints lasted long. The snow softened them quickly, pulling them back into itself, as though it didn't want them to stay. There were signs of life, but quiet ones. A branch chewed down to the nub. A hollow in the trunk of an old birch tree, lined with bits of moss. Somewhere, a bird called once, short and low, then didn't call again. The snow here wasn't untouched, just unbothered. Every inch of it had been walked on by something. Deer, maybe. Rabbits. Foxes. You couldn't always tell which, and the forest didn't seem inclined to help. The tracks overlapped in places and disappeared entirely in others. Some had filled in from the wind. Others remained like careful notes taken in powder. Along one stretch of ground, a shallow dip ran beneath a row of trees, the bare suggestion of a trail, not wide, not official, just a place where the ground sloped differently and the snow wore thinner from habit. You wouldn't have noticed it from a distance, but standing in it, you could feel the shape beneath your feet. Not flat, not level, but used. Branches above had collected snow in small nests of white. Some had let it slide. Others still held their weight. A few had cracked under pressure and hung limp at awkward angles, never quite reaching the ground. One tree had split at its base, long ago, maybe during a storm. The inside of the trunk was dark and wet, filled with decaying wood and bits of needles that had blown in from somewhere else. The snow had collected inside the crack, too, but hadn't melted. It sat there quietly, as if waiting to be useful. There were no signs of people, no sounds of boots crunching, no voices, just the occasional shift of wind and the soft, regular breath of cold air moving through trees that had forgotten what season it used to be. Everything about the woods felt slow, not lazy, not asleep, just in no rush to change. If anything had been built here, it wasn't anymore. If anything had been said, it hadn't needed repeating. If anything had been lost, it had learned how to stay still. And still the trees stood, and the snow stayed. And farther ahead, where the woods began to thin, the smallest curl of smoke lifted above the horizon, barely visible, barely real, just a thread, just enough to hint that something warm might be waiting at the edge of this stillness. The path didn't lead to the wall directly. It just began to drift beside it, close enough to see, but far enough to make it feel like a companion rather than a boundary. The wall wasn't tall. Most of it stood no higher than the knee, though some stones had shifted and fallen into uneven piles, raising it here and there in quiet humps. Moss clung to the northern side, dull green beneath a frosting of snow. It looked soft, but wasn't. No one had built this wall recently. It belonged to a time before current things. Its purpose had faded, but its presence hadn't. The stones were large and dark, some round, some jagged, none stacked with precision. They had simply been placed over years, probably by someone who needed a line more than a fence. Snow had drifted against it in lopsided mounds, forming shoulders along its base where the wind had slowed. The snow didn't cover the wall. It emphasized it, filled the gaps, smoothed the ridges. The whole thing looked as though it had grown up from the ground, with the frost. A few of the stones near the bottom had hollowed slightly with age, creating shallow pockets just big enough for small things to wait in. One such space, close to where the path narrowed, held a curled shape of fur and breath. A rabbit, ears tucked down, eyes half closed, still but not afraid. It didn't flinch when the wind passed. It didn't notice the footsteps. It had chosen the wall because it was there. That was enough. Farther down, a broken bit of rusted wire curled around one of the stones. The remains of something once nailed or tied. A loop of twine hung beside it, stiff with age and salt, the knot still intact. No one had tried to remove it. The wall had accepted the gesture long ago. Bits of bark and wind-snatched grass had gathered along the inner edge, caught where the snow dipped away from the stones. A pinecone sat among them, half covered, its scales splayed open and frosted at the tips. It looked arranged, but wasn't. Nothing here tried to be pretty. It just was. One of the tallest stones had a deep groove across the top. Not cut, not carved, just worn. Something heavy had rested there once. A boot, a pail, a hand leaning against it for balance. Now the groove held snow and a single feather, tucked against one corner, unmoving. A small brown bird stood on a nearby branch, just above the wall, hopping once, then twice, then pausing. It looked down, not at the wall exactly, but in the direction of it. Then it took off, quiet and quick, leaving nothing behind but a few flakes of snow scattered in its wake. Toward the far end of the wall, the stones curved slightly away from the path, angling back into the woods. The shape was subtle, not a turn, not a bend, just a suggestion that once, long ago, this line might have continued somewhere. It didn't now. The wall simply ended, not with a collapse, but with an absence. The last stones leaned gently into the earth, half submerged, no longer trying to hold anything up. The forest beyond was thicker there. Trees pressed in, bark darkened by snow melt, branches drawn low by cold. But the path stayed clear, just wide enough to walk, just worn enough to recognize. The wall didn't guide. It simply stood beside, and then turned ahead. The trail shifted slightly. The trees parted in the distance, and the faint ribbon of chimney smoke curled through the canopy again, a little closer now. The scent of wood fire whispered around the edge of the cold, almost too faint to name. Behind, the wall returned to quiet. It had always been there, and for now, it still was. The path narrowed for a while, not because anything blocked it, but because the forest leaned in. Branches reached just far enough to suggest hesitation, as though the trees were wondering if they ought to be letting anyone through. But the way remained open, not clear exactly, but known, like something had walked it often enough to leave the shape of a habit. Snow had gathered in uneven layers across the trail. In some places, it smoothed into a solid surface, faintly packed and muted underfoot. In others, it drifted soft and loose, thin at the top, but deep if you stepped wrong. A track, maybe, or a trick of the wind. The woods didn't offer clarification. Along the left side of the path, a line of tracks curved in and out of view. Tiny, with barely a half-step spacing between each. Probably a rabbit, though maybe not. The prints had been made before the most recent breeze, which had scattered them gently, brushing their edges so they seemed more remembered than recorded. The line curved once near the base of a tree, then veered off beneath a low branch and disappeared. Farther up, another set of tracks crossed the path, larger, deeper, wider spaced. These had come from the trees and led directly across the trail, vanishing into thicker brush beyond. A deer, likely, or something like one. The prints were recent. The snow hadn't filled them in, and the indentation still held its shape. One track caught the light and reflected a tiny glint of ice at the center, like the cold had decided to leave a mirror behind. The path sloped gently uphill. Not steep, just steady. As the elevation rose, the trees began to space themselves apart a little more, allowing patches of pale sky to peek through above. The wind moved differently here, less filtered, more aware. It rolled along the trail like it had walked it too many times to count, slipping around boots, over fur, under breath. A fallen branch crossed the trail, half buried in the snow. It hadn't broken recently. The wood was dry, stripped of bark, its edges frayed by weather and time. On its underside, a mouse-sized tunnel curved down into the drift and out again. Its entrance collapsed slightly, where something had entered or exited too quickly to care. A bit farther on, the trail turned gently to the right, and the snowpack thinned for a stretch. Here the ground felt more solid beneath the feet, the suggestion of old stones beneath dirt and snow, a path that might have once been paved, or maybe just well worn enough to hold its form beneath the weight of the years. On one of the stones, just visible through a patch of melting snow, was a faint circle of lichen, greenish brown and sleeping. The snow hadn't buried it entirely. It remained, pressed to the stone like a memory, too quiet to fade. To the side, a cluster of saplings had grown in tight formation, their trunks leaning slightly inward as if discussing something. Beneath them, only one set of tracks passed, deep, deliberate, towing forward with cautious rhythm. A fox, maybe, or a lone dog from long ago. The tracks didn't loop back. As the path curved once more, the view began to change. Through the trees ahead, the first lines of smoke rose again, thicker now, less thread and more ribbon. It rose slow, carried sideways a little by the breeze, then climbed again in long, lazy spirals. And beneath that smoke, just barely visible through the thinning pines, the edge of a rooftop. Wood slats dusted with snow. A chimney set slightly off-center. No movement, no light in the windows yet, just presence. The path didn't end. It simply began to feel like arrival, behind, The woods had closed in again, sealing the trail behind in hush. And ahead, something waited, not expectantly, just there. The cabin wasn't fully visible yet, but the woodpile was, tucked to the side of the trail where the trees finally pulled back. It sat beneath a lean-to made of planks and rusted nails. The roof sloped enough to keep most of the snow off. Not all, though. The top row of logs wore a dusting of white, like an afterthought. The kind that falls sideways in light wind and lands where it pleases. The pile had been stacked deliberately, but not perfectly. The rows leaned a little, bowed in some places. Some logs had split unevenly. Some had been stacked bark side out, others the opposite. Whoever did it hadn't been careless, just practical. It was the kind of work done in cold gloves, over days without audience. A few pieces had fallen from one side and lay crooked in the snow, not discarded, just unsettled. One had a green smear along its edge, maybe from moss, maybe from the axe blade. Another had a crack running through it, nearly split but still whole. If it was going to break, it hadn't decided when yet. The axe leaned nearby, its handle planted in a half-round. The head was dull from use, not neglect. The wood of the grip was smooth and dark, the kind of worn that came from repetition, not oil. A shallow dent ran along one side of the haft, the kind of mark you only notice when your hand closes over it. Shavings and splinters ringed the base of the chopping block, half frozen into the snow. Some looked freshly cut, others had been stepped on, pressed flat, or carried away slightly by wind. None had blown far. The air here didn't. Beside the stack, a canvas sling hung from a pair of rusted hooks, empty now, sagging from its own weight. The fabric was stiff with cold, creased from being folded and unfolded over time. A corner of it had torn and been stitched again with thick thread, black against faded brown. The repair was clean but old. A trail of prints curved away from the pile and back toward the cabin, broad, uneven, partially filled in. Someone had carried wood recently. Not in a rush, just enough to make a fire, just enough to last the evening. The logs themselves were a mix. Oak, maybe, birch, some darker, some pale, some still dotted with flecks of bark and the occasional frost-ringed knot. The ends of each piece were dry, split, hollow-ringing if tapped, lean to creak faintly when the wind changed direction. A single nail held a length of rope, coiled tight near the beam, unused, but not forgotten. Snow had begun to gather in the corner where roof and ground met. A squirrel had left tracks there earlier. They ended near a piece of kindling, then vanished. From this angle, The cabin could now be seen more clearly. Low roofline, one window facing the woodpile, glass dull and rimmed in frost. No curtain, just the faint reflection of trees behind the viewer, and the chimney, solid, dark, with a thin stream of smoke still rising. It curled upward gently and disappeared into the sky without comment. The smell of wood fire lingered around the pile, caught in the fibers of the canvas sling. The grain of the logs, the collar of a coat, no longer hanging nearby, not strong, just present. A warmth that hadn't reached the body yet, but was already known. The ground near the pile was packed unevenly, not from traffic, just from habit. A spot where boots had stood often. Weight shifting slightly with each swing of the axe. No one was there now, but it didn't feel abandoned, just paused. The fire inside was likely already burning. The wood here had done its part. The rest waited. Quiet, unbothered, useful without needing to be used. Behind, the path disappeared into the tree. Ahead, the lantern still hadn't lit, and the steps sat patient beneath a thin blanket of snow. It hung to the right of the door, where the eave sloped just enough to shelter it from the worst of the snowfall. The lantern was old, but not broken. Its frame had blackened over time, dulled by soot and salt and cold. The glass panes were fogged with dust and condensation, their corners lined with faint spiderweb cracks. Not broken through, just aged into imperfection. The hook it hung from was iron, driven deep into the beam above. Rust crawled along the curve of it like ivy, frozen in place. The lantern didn't sway much, just enough to acknowledge the wind when it passed, just enough to shift slightly, as if remembering how to move. There was no light inside her. The wick sat unlit, blackened and cold, floating in a pool of hardened wax at the base. The fuel reservoir was empty, or nearly so. You couldn't tell by looking. You could only guess from the way the wick seemed tired, like it had been lit and burned out too many times to be startled by silence. The glass wasn't clean. It bore the smudges of gloves, the faint arcs of fingers pressed gently when lifting it down, then up again. The marks weren't fresh, but they hadn't been wiped away either. Like most things here, the lantern hadn't been abandoned, just left as it was, in no rush to be made new. Snow had started to gather on the lantern's top. Just a thin crust, not thick enough to weigh it down, but enough to round its edges. The melting had already begun near the base, where the wind curled under the eaves. Droplets formed, gathered, and then slid silently down the glass, vanishing into the cold metal rim. A small moth clung to one of the inner corners. Dead, probably, caught there during a warmer night, long ago, when the lantern had burned for hours and drew quiet things out of the dark. Its wings were intact, tilted just slightly upward, as though frozen in flight. It didn't fall when the wind shifted. Beneath the lantern, the wooden wall showed a faint scorch mark, a vertical line of shadow, where heat had risen again and again. The mark didn't feel dangerous. It felt earned, as though it belonged there more than the lantern did. Near the lantern, tucked against the wall, a tin box sat on a narrow shelf. Hinged lid, paint peeling. Inside were matches, thick, wooden, the kind that strike with a sound you remember more than hear. A few had been used and tucked back in, black tips barely bent. The box wasn't sealed. It didn't need to be. Snow hadn't reached inside. The shelf also held a small tin cup, turned upside down. Dust ringed the rim. Beneath it, the wood was lighter, protected from time not by intention, but by accident. A spider had once woven something there. The remnants of the web still clung to the underside of the cup, stretched thin, no longer catching anything. Footprints circled the lantern's base. Not many, not new. Some pressed down by boot heels, others blurred by melting and wind. They told no story, just suggested presence. Someone had stood here, more than once, long enough to adjust something. Maybe the wick, maybe the hook, maybe just to look at the light before deciding not to use it. The lantern didn't mind. It didn't ask to be useful. It was there to be lit when the dark needed shaping. Tonight the dark hadn't asked. A curl of smoke passed above it, sweeping gently along the underside of the eaves. The chimney worked quietly, unannounced. Warmth was already somewhere inside, doing its job. The door beside the lantern remained closed, but not stiff. Snow had gathered along its base and up the seams, powder fine, like the wind had been careful not to disturb anything. The threshold felt like the edge of something, but not the beginning, just the next quiet. Behind, the woods were already soft and blurry with distance. The path was barely more than memory. And here, beside a lantern that hadn't been used, was still the sense of light. The steps were shallow, only 3 of them, but each one felt like a pause. They didn't rise high, didn't creak much, didn't demand balance, just a quiet lift from earth to threshold, made of weathered wood that had grey-toned with age. Snow had gathered along the outer edges, softened at the corners, like the cold didn't want to interfere. It just wanted to stay nearby. The top step held more snow than the others, blown in sideways beneath the eaves. It hadn't been disturbed. No boot prints, no melting, just a thin, even blanket. Like someone had folded a sheet of white cloth and laid it gently over the boards. Wind had brushed faint ripples into it. Not enough to call texture, just enough to keep it from shining. A few stray needles had landed there too, pine, brittle, scattered. One had wedged itself into the gap between two boards, barely visible beneath the snow. Another sat upright in a way that defied explanation, as if it had decided it belonged. The middle step sagged slightly in the center, its boards flexing a little more than the others. Not from damage, just wear. The wood still held, it just knew how to yield. One of the nails in its front edge had risen half a finger's width above the surface, ringed in a tiny crown of rust. It didn't snag on anything. It just caught the eye if you happened to look. A single footprint had been pressed into the second step days ago, wide, treaded, filled now with ice that had melted and refrozen more than once. The pattern was mostly gone. Just an outline remained, like the shape of someone who had come home, carrying something in both hands and hadn't looked down. The bottom step had the most snow. It blended into the path, almost indistinguishable from the drifted trail leading back toward the woods. If you didn't know it was a step, you might not notice the difference in height. Only the shadow told you where one ended and the other began. A broom leaned just to the side, bristles warped from damp, the handle still upright. It hadn't been used today. Maybe not yesterday either, but it hadn't fallen over. It rested against the siding as if placed there deliberately, waiting for someone to remember it, or not. Near the edge of the top step, a half-burned match lay where it had fallen. Just one. The blackened tip pointed toward the door. The wind hadn't carried it off, and the snow hadn't buried it. It didn't look dropped. It looked set down and forgotten, or left on purpose. The door ahead had darkened at the bottom, where boots had brushed it for years. A faint scuff in the center looked like it came from a heel turning, or someone nudging it open with their foot when their hands were full. The paint, once maybe red, maybe brown, had faded to something between the two. One hinge squeaked gently when the wind pushed too hard, but the door didn't move. It just responded. The handle was simple, brass probably, dull with cold, scratched around the base where keys had missed the lock in the dark more times than anyone cared to count. It wasn't polished, it wasn't decorative. It worked. Next to the top step, a small indentation had formed in the snow where someone had set something heavy. Maybe a bag of wood, maybe a satchel, maybe nothing at all. The shape remained, even though the object didn't. The snow hadn't bothered to fill it in. The air here felt still, even with the wind. Still in a way that suggested shelter more than silence. The kind of stillness that waits without needing to be acknowledged. The steps didn't creak when you stood on them, but they would have softly if you had weight, just enough to say, "You're here." That's all. And ahead, the door didn't swing. It simply allowed. The air inside wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was the temperature of still wood settled long ago into its role. The kind of air that had been inside for so long it didn't remember the outside clearly anymore. The first breath tasted like dust, old paper, and the faintest ghost of firewood. Not from today, but from some other day. Layered and lingering, the floor was uneven just past the threshold. A board tilted slightly downward, enough to make your foot pause and adjust. A rug sat there, not to catch snow, not to welcome, just to mark the point where the world changed from open to enclosed. It had once been striped in some muted pattern. Now it was just faded thread, edges curled, center flattened by repetition. Lined the wall to the left, 4 pairs, none matched, all worn. One had a snapped lace looped around the tongue. Another had a smear of something green dried across the heel. The largest pair still held the shape of feet inside them, like they'd been taken off while still warm and never shaken out. Snow had melted in each at some point. The stains around the soles were ringed and dry. Above them, a set of wooden pegs held coats, some thick, lined in flannel or fur-trimmed at the hood, others thin, more for wind than cold. One was draped across 2 pegs, slouched under its own weight. The smell of outside clung to them, not fresh, not sharp, just earthy, like bark or wet leaves remembered from a pocket. A scarf hung from the last peg. It was unraveling near one end, lubed once and forgotten. A pair of gloves sat stuffed into the sleeve of the coat beside it, fingers bent backward in rest. A single mitten lay on the bench below, striped blue and white, child-sized, with a loop of yarn still knotted at the wrist. The bench itself was narrow, made from a single split plank, its surface warped over time. Someone had tried to sand the edges, but only on one side. It wasn't for sitting long, just long enough to pull off boots or sigh. On the windowsill above the bench, a small row of objects rested without fanfare. A round stone, a feather, a flat piece of glass, pale green, smoothed by time. None were arranged, they just were. The window was fogged at the corners, Frost clung to the bottom of the pane in thin, star-like patterns. Outside, the snow was still falling, not hard, not steady, just enough to dust the air. A lantern sat near the door on a side shelf, its glass clean but its wick untouched. Next to it, a matchbox with the top half torn and a single match resting diagonally inside. The kind of placement you don't notice until you realize someone had been meaning to use it, then didn't. The door eased itself shut with a soft thump. No latch clicked. It simply closed. The air inside barely shifted. There were no sounds from deeper in the house. No fire crackling, no kettle whistling, just the ambient weight of walls. The floor creaked once, not from footsteps, but from remembering them. Coat hook near the door had snapped long ago and been nailed back in at an angle. A second hole remained beside it, filled with putty that had never been sanded smooth. The wall bore scratches at waist height, the kind left by bags with metal buckles, or a child's wooden sled dragged too close one too many times. Everything in the entryway belonged to no one in particular. Everything had been touched, used, paused with. Nothing was decorative. Everything was meant to be, needed, even if it hadn't been lately. And farther in, where the hallway bent and the shadows thickened, a stove waited without smoke. A window waited with a view no one looked through. And the house held its breath, not because it was startled, but because stillness had become its habit. The kitchen didn't greet. It wasn't that kind of room. It simply existed, already in the middle of things, whether anyone was present or not. Light filtered in from a window over the sink, thin and grey, softened by frost on the outside of the glass. It illuminated everything gently, casting long, faint shadows that didn't quite reach the floor's far corner. The counters were wood, not polished, not sealed, just boards laid flat and treated with care a long time ago. Scratches showed where knives had passed over them, where jars had been set down too quickly, where time had worn through varnish and made its own patterns. A scattering of flour dusted one end of the surface, not freshly sprinkled, but left behind from a task unfinished or cleaned in a hurry. A kettle sat near the stove, not on it, just close, as though it had been used recently or might be again soon. Its handle was wrapped in twine to keep the heat at bay. One side of the spout had blackened from where steam had escaped too often. The lid didn't sit flush anymore. It rested at a slight angle, perfectly balanced, perfectly still. The stove itself was cast iron, The kind with a firebox that creaked when opened and stoveplates that could be lifted with a hooked rod still hanging beside it. It wasn't lit now, but faint warmth still hovered above it. Residual heat, not enough to cook anything, just enough to suggest that someone had been here recently and had every intention of coming back. Above it, a rack hung with a row of dried herbs, thyme, sage, something else that had lost its name, its shape. They rustled faintly when the wind caught the cracks around the windows, like paper being stirred by thought. The scent had faded, or maybe it had just become part of the wood. An enamel mug sat on the sill, chipped at the rim. Inside, a tea bag had dried into a curled shape, still clinging to the string that trailed over the edge and onto the wood. The tag had fallen off. The stain at the bottom of the mug was shaped like a crescent or a fingerprint, or nothing at all. A loaf of bread rested beneath a towel on the counter. The cloth had gone stiff in the folds from dried dough. The loaf underneath had flattened slightly, the crust soft rather than crisp. It had been baked a day ago, or longer. It was still good enough. Near the back wall, a shelf held jars, not arranged, just placed. Some were empty, others half filled, with lentils, dried beans, tiny black seeds that didn't scatter even when the jar tipped sideways. A few lids didn't match. One jar had a bit of twine tied around the neck, holding nothing. A single chair sat tucked beneath the narrow table. The legs had been repaired, one with a metal brace, the other with a strip of cloth tied tight to stop a wobble. On the seat, a cushion had worn thin in the center, the stuffing uneven but not escaping. Someone had sat here, more than once, maybe while the kettle boiled, maybe just to think. In the far corner, a basket rested beside the firewood bin. It held potatoes, not many. A few had begun to sprout in gentle curls of pale root, blind and slow. One had split slightly. Another bore a mark like a thumbprint, softened over time. The bin next to it was nearly empty. Only 2 logs remained. The rest had already been burned or never brought in. The cabinets didn't quite close all the way. One hung slightly crooked, and the paint around the hinges had cracked into spider-leg lines. Inside, a tin with loose tea, a mug with a chipped base, and a folded cloth someone had once meant to iron and never did. There were no clocks, no timers, just light through frost and heat that waited to return. The house didn't cook tonight. But the kitchen remembered how. The stove was alive, not roaring, not blazing, just steady, like a breath held and released over and over without needing to be noticed. It sat in the corner of the living space, tucked between 2 walls that had darkened with heat over the years. The metal body had dulled to a soft black, smoothed by air and time. On top, a small pan rested empty, turned slightly off-center, its handle pointing toward nothing. The fire inside didn't crackle. It pulsed, a low, occasional pop of expanding wood. The scent was more ember than flame. Faint smoke, pine resin, something sweet tucked deep in the grain. It wasn't strong enough to fill the house, just enough to linger on fabric and drift in the folds of the curtains. The curtains were thick and uneven. One had been hemmed by hand, in thread a shade too dark. The other bore a faint line of soot along its base from years of brushing against the stove's breath. They were pulled halfway closed, not for privacy, but to hold in what little heat had gathered near the floor. The chair nearest the stove was low-backed and slightly tilted from one leg that didn't sit flat. Someone had folded a piece of cardboard under it once, long removed, but the crease in the floorboards remained. A knitted throw was draped over the armrest. Not folded, not arranged, just placed. The yarn was coarse, the pattern uneven, the kind of handmade that meant someone had once tried without caring much about the outcome. Beside the chair, a small table leaned against the wall. On it sat a candle in a brass holder, burned halfway down. The wax had pooled and cooled unevenly, one side leaning toward the edge. The wick was blackened, but untrimmed, waiting for a flame that hadn't come yet. A pair of reading glasses lay open on a closed book. The spine was creased, the corners soft. A bookmark stuck out at an odd angle, a torn envelope with faded ink along the edge. The glasses weren't modern. They were slightly bent at the nose bridge. One arm polished smoother than the other. Someone had worn them often. Someone had left them there without urgency. The rug beneath the stove was wool. Maybe. The pattern had long since faded into suggestion. One corner curled upward from a scorch mark that didn't burn through but came close. The other corners stayed flat, pinned by habit more than weight. Along the back wall, shelves lined with books sagged just slightly in the center. The titles were worn off most of the spines. A few leaned against each other like tired travelers. One had been pulled halfway out, then pushed back at the wrong angle. Dust had gathered unevenly across the top row, except where a hand had once brushed it clear. A clock hung above the shelves, quiet. Its hands had stopped, just past midnight, or maybe noon. Hard to tell. It ticked when it wanted to, but not always. The sound wasn't missed. The silence was complete without it. A basket of kindlings sat near the stove, half gilled. Twigs, shavings, a few pine cones with soot still clinging to the tips. The kindling had been collected, not bought. Some pieces were too thin to burn properly, but they stayed anyway, just in case. There was a second chair across the room, lower to the ground, cushioned at the seat, but not the back. The fabric had frayed at the edges, threads hanging loose like roots. A quilt was folded over the backrest. One corner of it had unraveled, tucked into itself to keep the threads from pulling further. The floor here was warm, not hot, just gently radiating what the stove gave off. Enough to make the boards feel alive under bare feet. Enough to hold heat long after the fire died down. The warmth didn't chase away the cold. It just made room for it, until the two stopped bothering to argue. There were no photos on the walls, no decorations, just a hook for a hat that hadn't been worn in years, and a single nail sticking out beneath it with nothing to hold. But the room didn't feel empty. It felt kept, without performance, without apology. The fire flickered once and held. The bedroom didn't feel separate from the rest of the cabin. There was no door, only a low archway and a shift in light. The air grew stiller here, not cooler, just quieter, like sound knew not to move too fast. The walls were the same wood as the rest of the house, but the knots were darker in this room, more clustered, as if the grain had thickened to hold something in. The bed was built into the wall, a low frame with a headboard made from reclaimed boards. The slats were uneven, two of them cracked, one bow forward slightly. The mattress wasn't thick, but it didn't look uncomfortable, just used, just shaped by years of lying still. A quilt covered it, patchworked from dozens of fabrics, most of them faded, some torn, a few stitched carefully by hand. You could read a history in the shapes. One square had stars, another stripes, another tiny faded flowers. One patch near the center had the outline of a sun, barely visible now. The quilt was heavy in the way only well-worn things are, not from weight, but from memory. The pillow had gone flat at the corners and fat in the middle. It didn't sit straight. It leaned toward the wall like it had given up on being fluffed. The pillowcase was pale blue, frayed at the hem, the opening slightly gaping but never wide enough to lose the pillow inside. A small table sat beside the bed, its legs mismatched, one thicker than the others. A crack ran through its surface, but it had been sealed long ago with wax or glue or care. On top rested a glass of water, untouched. The rim had fogged over. The light coming through the frost-laced window caught in it, softening the edges. There was a book beside the glass, face down, spine tired. The pages had curled just slightly, like they'd taken on the shape of the air. A bit of twine had been used as a bookmark, knotted at the end and stiff from where it had once been wet. The title of the book had worn off the cover. The window near the bed was small and square, framed in chipped paint. Frost had crept up the glass in delicate lines, like feathers of veins. The world outside was blurred. Only the nearest trees could be seen, and even they looked softened, like they were part of a memory. You weren't trying too hard to recall. A window sat a trunk, its lid half open. Inside were folded blankets, not neat, not stacked, just placed. One was wool, striped and heavy. Another looked handmade, stitched but unfinished. The edge had never been hemmed, and the thread still dangled, like it was waiting for someone to come back to it. The floor in the bedroom was softer somehow, not carpeted, just quieter. The boards had learned how to give without creaking. A woven mat lay at the foot of the bed, its pattern faded in the center, still visible around the edges. A boot print had once stained it, then vanished. The shape remained in the fibers, pressed and stretched. A lamp stood on a shelf above the bed. Battery-powered, maybe. The kind you push once to turn on, again to turn off. Dust had gathered on the button. No one had pressed it in a while. There was no mirror, no dresser, no clock, just a room that knew what it was for, the kind of space that didn't ask questions, didn't require stories, just offered stillness. And beneath the bed, a drawer had been pulled halfway open. Inside, a small stone, a dried leaf, and a piece of string tied in a knot, so simple it looked complicated. Nothing valuable, nothing explained, but nothing left behind carelessly either. The bedroom didn't make promises. It didn't need to. It simply held and waited for rest. A turn. The closet was shallow, not quite built into the wall, more like added after the fact, framed with boards that didn't match the rest of the room. Its door had no handle, just a thumb-worn notch at the edge where fingers had pressed enough times to shape it smooth. It didn't stick, but it sighed a little when opened. Not a creak, just that soft wooden exhale old hinges make when no one's asked them to move in a while. Inside, the air was cooler, not cold, just untouched. It smelled of dust and linen, of wool that hadn't been worn in years. Not mildew, not rot, just the long sleep of fabric. 2 coats hung from the rail, one long and dark, with a collar worn thin at the edges, the other shorter, patched at the sleeve with thread that didn't quite match. A single button had been replaced with one too large, held in place by wire instead of thread. The wire was twisted tightly, as though someone had meant to do it properly later and never did. A third hanger held nothing. Just the shape of something once hung there. The wood of the hanger had a nick at one end, the kind a pocket knife makes when it slips. It didn't look new. It didn't look guilty. On the floor, a pair of boots sat heel to toe. The laces were still tied. One tongue had collapsed inward. The other was standing tall, but only barely. They looked like they'd been set there after a long day and simply not moved again, not forgotten, just done. A folded blanket sat on the shelf above the rail. It was thick, grey and square, the edges stitched in a colour that had likely once been red. The corner was turned down slightly, revealing the edge of something beneath it. A piece of folded paper, yellowed, stiff. A receipt, maybe, or a list, or nothing important at all. Next to the blanket, a small tin box had lost most of its paint. Its lid was scratched, and a dent along one side kept it from closing completely. Inside, a spool of thread, 2 loose buttons, a thimble with a crack down one side, and a piece of chalk the size of a fingertip. Tailor's chalk, probably, but no clothes were being mended now. A wool cap rested in the far corner of the shelf, folded into itself. The cuff bore the imprint of ears, the shape it takes when worn again and again in cold wind. A single strand of hair clung to the inside, too fine to place, too light to remove. There were hooks along the back wall of the closet, 3 in total. One held a scarf knotted in a loop that had stiffened over time. The second hook held nothing but the imprint of something once hung there, marked by dust and the absence of it. The third was bent downward, not broken, but tired. A small cardboard box had been pushed to the far back corner of the closet floor. Its top was open, corners sagging from moisture that had come and gone many times over the years. Inside, a map folded round, a coil of twine, and a flat stone painted with what might have once been a letter, now faded to nothing but colour. Someone had started something there. A marking, a moment. Along the closet wall, a shelf had been added. Just a single plank, balanced on brackets. It wasn't level, but it held what it needed to. A jar filled with nails, a pocket knife with one broken blade, and a roll of tape that had dried into unusability. The kind of things kept just in case, even when no case ever comes. The closet didn't feel hidden. It wasn't trying to be secret. It just wasn't interested in being seen unless asked, and even then it offered no stories, only object, way, shape, history, in the form of silence. The door closed without sound. The gap at the bottom let in just enough light to prove it hadn't vanished. It was still there. It would still be there tomorrow, because some things don't wait to be used. They just stay. The stairs to the attic were narrower than the others, steep, with a sharp turn halfway up. The boards were lighter here, pine instead of oak, and they creaked in a higher pitch, like a different kind of memory had been stored in them. Dust had collected along the edge of each step, disturbed only in the center, where a single path of footsteps had worn through, and even that was faint. The railing was a simple length of wood, rounded by hand or time. One of the brackets had come loose and been repaired with string, tied tight but uneven. It held, but not confidently. The kind of fix made in a moment and left in place for years because it worked and no one minded. The top of the stairs opened into a low landing. The ceiling sloped downward on both sides, making the space feel smaller than it was. Light came in through a single window at the far end, dusty and filtered, angled sharply by the roofline. The panes were streaked with frost, and the faint outline of a hand that had touched the glass long ago and never wiped it clean. The air was still, not stale, just unmoved. It carried the scent of paper, of wood dried too many seasons in a row, of boxes and quiet. To the left, an old trunk sat beneath the eaves. The leather strap had long since cracked and broken, and someone had wrapped it in rope instead, knotted in 3 places and frayed at the edges. The lid wasn't closed all the way. Inside, folded blankets, a pair of snowshoes, a book with no title, and a lantern without a wick. None of it looked used recently. None of it looked discarded. A narrow shelf ran along the back wall, sagging slightly in the middle. It held jars, mismatched, some clear, some brown, a few with labels faded into ghosts of handwriting. One had a feather inside, another held a rusted key. One was empty except for a dried leaf pressed flat against the glass, its veins still visible like a map. No one had travelled in a long time. A small desk sat beneath the window. It had only one drawer, which didn't close all the way. A pencil rested on the surface, worn to a nub, unsharpened, the eraser long used up. Next to it, a sheet of paper had yellowed with age and curled slightly at the corners. Nothing was written on it, but it had been placed there deliberately, centered and straight, as if something had almost been said and then wasn't. A wooden box on the floor had tipped on its side. Inside were spools of thread, a folded scarf, and a single mitten with the thumb torn out. The scarf smelled faintly of cedar, or perhaps that was just the air pretending. Icicles had formed outside the window, hanging like slow thoughts. When the wind shifted, they tapped against the glass. Not loudly, just enough to let you know they were still there. The insulation in the walls had settled unevenly. In one corner, the boards bowed slightly inward, the nails holding, but only just. A piece of cloth had been wedged in the gap, maybe to block the draft. It hadn't worked, but no one had removed it. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust. Not untouched, just undisturbed. Tracks crossed it in faint diagonal lines. A mouse, likely, or a beetle. One path stopped abruptly beneath the desk. Nothing emerged on the other side. A coat hung from a peg on the wall, stiff with cold. Its arms drooped as if it had grown tired of reaching for anything. The fabric had once been green, but was now the color of lichen or sea glass. The collar stood up on one side, as though waiting for a breeze that never came. There were no footsteps up here. No voices, no sense of recentness, just the quiet weight of things that had not moved and would not move unless asked. The attic didn't whisper, it didn't hum, it just held on. And the house below never asked why. The fire had settled into coals. No open flames now, just the red-orange glow of embers layered thick and low in the stove's belly. They pulsed in and out like a breath half held. Like someone was still breathing somewhere nearby. Not urgently, just because they could. The Cost's iron stove ticked now and then as it adjusted to the shift in heat. The sound wasn't loud, just enough to remind the room that warmth was still happening, even if it had changed shape. A log had fallen inward sometime in the last hour, leaving a new angle in the pile. A soft collapse of weight, unbothered. Above the stovepipe hummed, not audibly exactly, more like a pressure you could feel if you leaned in close. A low vibration, the echo of heat moving upward in soft ribbons. The chimney carried it without complaint, letting the smoke drift slowly into the night. You couldn't smell it anymore. It had woven itself into the cabin already. The light from the coals didn't reach far. It spilled out through the small open hatch in soft pulses, catching on the brass of the kettle's handle, the edge of the rug, the faint arc of a chair's shadow. Everything flickered gently, like it wasn't quite committed to its shape. A mug rested on the table nearby, half full, its surface no longer steaming. The tea inside had cooled, but not gone cold. A slight haze still clung to the rim, the warmth that lingers when the fire doesn't ask for more. The air had thickened, but not with smoke, just density, that slow golden weight that fire gives to a room when it's been burning long enough to be trusted. The rocking chair closest to the stove leaned slightly back, unmoving. A blanket had been draped across the backrest, one corner trailing onto the floor, the other folded neatly over the arm. The wood beneath it had warmed, not evenly, just in patches where the fire's light had touched again and again. Book sat open on the armrest, pages curled from humidity and heat. One page was dog-eared, the other had a small smudge where a finger had pressed too long. The words didn't matter. The spine had broken in a way that suggested this was not the first reading, or even the fifth. The room had taken on that quiet echo that only happens after a fire has stopped growing. It wasn't diminishing, just resting in place. A presence more than a performance. The woodpile beside the stove was lower now. Only a few small pieces remained. 2 split logs, a wedge of kindling, a stub of something soft and white. Pine, maybe. Birch. They sat there like offerings not yet accepted. A bit of ash had spilled from the stove onto the hearth. A soft line, barely visible in the dim light. It looked almost deliberate, like the fire had signed its name before going still. On the ceiling above, the beam that ran the length of the room had warmed too. Not from the fire directly, but from time. It bore the mark of smoke in its grain, that faint shadowing that comes from years of rising heat. A spiderweb stretched between it and the wall. Empty, but undisturbed. A nail stuck out from the beam's edge, long rusted. Nothing hung from it now, but it cast a shadow anyway, long and sharp, pointed downward, like it still remembered how to hold weight. Somewhere in the walls, the warmth had reached its furthest extent. The outer edges of the house had begun to cool again, quietly reclaiming the cold that the fire had asked to borrow. Not aggressively, just inevitably. The stove didn't mind. It had done its work. The fire didn't burn brighter. It just stayed, held together by ash, by ember, a breath, and the cabin exhaled. Not loud, not final, just enough to shift the shadows once more. The roofline held snow the way a hand might hold silence, carefully, without urgency. It had gathered overnight and throughout the day, not in thick drifts, but in soft, even layers. Nothing had slid loose, nothing had melted. The eaves curved gently outward, and the snow followed that curve like a second roof laid gently over the first. Icicles hung from the edge in uneven intervals, some long, some barely started. One had broken halfway down and now leaned like a bent candle, frozen in the act of giving way. When the wind pushed just right, they tapped against the wood, a soft clink, like a wind chime made of time and cold water. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Not much, just enough to curl into the early dark, catching the last of the light and turning it into suggestion. The column bent and shifted, not in protest, just in agreement with the wind. The snow on the ground hadn't been touched in hours, maybe longer. No new prints, no fallen branches. The wind had been gentle, brushing the surface just enough to raise the older disturbances, to smooth the skin of the world. It was the kind of stillness that made sound irrelevant. The woodpile on the side of the house had been brushed lightly with new snow, a fine dusting on the topmost logs, too soft to stay long. One log near the edge had fallen at some point and now rested half buried. The shape of it was still clear. It hadn't rolled far. A shovel leaned against the wall near the door, not recently used. Snow had gathered around its base in a shallow arc, filling the space between the handle and the siding. The blade had rusted in a single spot where the paint had worn away. It didn't look neglected, just at rest. The lantern still hung by the door, and now its glass caught the glow from the chimney's plume, throwing faint reflections against the cabin's wall. It didn't illuminate anything. It didn't need to. The wind picked up slightly. Not loud, just longer. It moved through the trees nearby and bent the slow-laden boughs in slow arcs. Nothing snapped, nothing fell, just a brief shift, a soft suggestion that even the quiet things still moved. Footprints from earlier that day were nearly gone. A few indentations remained near the steps, rounded and shallow, like small pools frozen in place. One held a bit of ice, thin enough to crack under breath alone. The cabin's windows reflected back the dimming world. Not clearly, just shapes. The glow of the fire inside had faded now, reduced to suggestion, but it was still there, still visible in the warping of the glass. A bird passed overhead, fast, silent, without warning. Just a shadow against the snow where none had been before. It didn't land. It didn't call. It continued toward whatever birds seek in the dark. Near the corner of the cabin, a small drift had piled up against the siding, curled like the edge of a blanket. It wasn't deep, just deliberate. A twig stuck out of it, clean, dry, pointing nowhere in particular. The snow beyond the cabin sloped gently downward toward the tree line. In the distance, a single branch had broken off the pine and now lay atop the snow. It hadn't fallen loudly. It hadn't made a scene, but there it was, a line against a canvas that hadn't asked for one. The cabin itself didn't stand out. It blended. Roofline, snow, smoke, sky. It didn't announce anything. It didn't say, "Someone lives here." It only said, "This place continues." The land had accepted it long ago, and tonight is simply let it be. The trees didn't begin so much as return, spreading out from the snow behind the cabin, like a thought you'd almost forgotten and then remembered all at once. They stood tall and bare, their trunks dark against the pale ground. Some bent slightly under the weight of snow, but not enough to snap. The snow here was deeper than it had been by the wall or the trail. It drifted in soft ridges, carried over by wind and gravity, not by intention. Nothing had passed this way in hours, maybe longer. The only marks were where snow had slumped from a limb, landing in a puff that flattened into stillness almost instantly. A few animal tracks skirted the edges of the clearing. Rabbit, maybe, or fox. Their trails wandered without destination, looping once, vanishing under the brush, then reappearing yards away. One set led toward a cluster of bushes, then stopped entirely, as if the animal had been picked up by the wind and moved elsewhere, but there were no wing prints. Crystals had formed on the lowest branches, not snow, but hoarfrost. Crystals grown in silence. Each one glittered faintly in the failing light, not sparkling, just holding light gently. If you looked closely, the shapes of them still held their order. Hexes and spires and stars, no larger than a breath. Wind moved differently here, not stronger, but more certain. It came from the northeast in a long, slow push, curling through the trees and turning sideways as it met the trunks. It didn't howl. It moved like it remembered the shape of the forest and was simply following its own routine. Somewhere beyond the edge, A creek ran under ice. You couldn't hear it yet, but the dip in the land gave it away. A line of low brush marked its direction, red twigs sharp against the white. The snow above the water was thinner, smoother, like the warmth below had pushed back just enough to resist. The cabin behind was still visible from this angle, small, boxy, tucked into the land rather than set on top of it. Smoke still rose from the chimney, though thinner now. It drifted upward in a slow spiral before breaking and drifting sideways, blending with the treetops until it wasn't smoke anymore, just dusk. From this distance, the whole scene looked like something remembered more than seen. The kind of memory that doesn't begin with a moment, but with a feeling. Cool air on your skin, the hush of thick snow, the dull ache in your hands from carrying wood. A single crow called once from deeper in the trees, low and hoarse. Not alarmed, just present. It didn't call again. Its wings rustled once, then settled. You couldn't see it, but the sound was enough. A branch overhead let go of its snow with a soft shush, landing in a puff beside a tree root. The impact startled nothing. The woods took it in, as if they'd expected it. Closer to the tree line, a fallen log had been hollowed slightly by weather and time. Snow had drifted inside it, but not enough to fill it completely. Inside the cavity, a pine cone sat half frozen, a single needle stuck through its center like a pin through cloth. There were no paths here, no footprints, just openings, suggestions of where someone could walk if they wanted to. But the woods didn't ask for anyone. They offered nothing except space. Stillness here wasn't absence, it was density. Everything stood still, not because it had to, but because it had learned how. And above it all, the sky had begun to shift from blue to grey to that soft, indeterminate violet. That means the light is leaving. The stars hadn't come yet, finished, but the sky had started listening. The sky didn't open all at once. It unfolded slowly, like someone unrolling cloth in the dark, revealing a shape that was always there, but didn't need to be named. The last of the light had drained into the horizon, leaving behind a color that didn't quite commit to blue, didn't quite settle on black. One star appeared, small, low, flickering slightly, not because it was unsure, but because the air still moved between here and there. Then another, then two more, spread wide and uneven across the canvas. None of them rushed, The stars were never in a hurry. Above the cabin, the smoke from the chimney continued its upward drift. Thinner now, but still visible, it curled toward the sky, bending once in the breeze, then straightening as it rose past the treetops, as if the trees were giving it permission to leave. The stars didn't react to the smoke. They simply let it pass. Their job wasn't to intervene, just to remain. The moon was still low. A sliver tonight. Barely enough to reflect off the snow, but enough to catch on ice-crusted branches and the distant glass of the cabin's windows. It didn't shine. It glowed. The kind of light you only notice when it touches something else. The thin line of cloud swept across the upper sky, high enough to blur some of the starlight. It didn't stay long. The wind took it eastward, out of view. Behind it, the constellations settled into place. Not for you, not for anyone in particular, just because they always did. The Big Dipper tilted gently, its bowl tipped forward like it was pouring out light. Orion stood farther off, one shoulder lost in the haze, the belt still clear. Other stars had no names here, just patterns. Some faint, some sharp, all watching. Below, the trees swayed once, then held still. Their branches had taken on a silver sheen, not from frost, but from reflection. Moonlight clinging to their edges like memory. A breeze moved through the higher branches, carrying a single pine needle loose from its perch. It drifted downward in slow spirals, barely touching the air around it, then landed on the snow. From this height, above the chimney, above the roofline, above the path and the fence and the hill, the cabin looked like an object held gently in the palm of the land. Small, steady, breathing, maybe. A soft glow pulsed once behind a window. Or maybe that was just the fire remembering itself. Farther out, the forest curved over the landscape like a shore, not covering, just keeping company. No movement stirred at its edge, no lights, no creatures passing. Just the soft echo of presence. The stars continued to settle in. Their light didn't grow stronger. The dark just stepped further back. In the far distance, a plane passed, silent from here, but marked by a single blinking dot that moved too fast to belong. It didn't interrupt. It simply reminded. Some lives moved quickly, even when the sky stayed still. The smoke from the chimney faded now, growing thinner, vanishing into the upper cold. Not extinguished, just resolved. The warmth had reached its apex, and the air no longer needed to carry it anywhere. And still the stars held. One blinked out behind a passing cloud. Another reappeared in the corner of vision. Something overlooked until it wanted to be seen. That was how they were. They didn't call for attention. But they stayed, high above it all, where the cold no longer touched anything, and time passed in wide circles. A single point of light moved gently across the sky. Satellite, maybe, or star trailing wind. No one to tell, but it saw the cabin, saw the trail, saw the soft, even breath of the chimney, and kept going. The beam from the lantern hadn't shone tonight, and still light had moved, not in lines, but in presence. It had risen with the fire, curled with the smoke, caught in the frost on the window glass and the pale gleam of stars. Now it drifted farther out, past the edge of the trees, past the frozen creek, beyond the slope where no one walked. Out here, the snow lay untouched, miles of it, soft and unbothered. The wind moved over it like breath through linen, barely lifting the top layer, barely leaving a mark. A ridge of rocks stretched low across the ground, half buried and ringed with shadow. One had a crack, filled with ice. Another bore the weight of a small, overturned tin can, rusted, forgotten. A field opened up beyond the rocks. The snow there had formed ripples, not deep, not perfect, just the kind made by long, slow wind, and nothing interrupting it. In the center of the field a stump stood. Snow had shaped itself around it like a collar, and a feather stuck out from the top. Not placed, not planted, just there. The sky overhead held more stars now, some faint, some bold. One blinked slowly near the horizon, red at the edges. Another held steady. The world below didn't reach up to them. It didn't need to. It simply reflected what it could. Farther still, past the field, the land dipped. A valley, where fog sometimes gathered, but didn't tonight. A trail cut through it, barely visible. Not a road, just memory pressed into snow. A deer had passed through earlier, or a fox. The track was softened now, blurred by time and chill, but it was still there, the shape of something moving once. The beam, if you could call it that, no longer held direction. It had become the air itself, the silence, the way frost formed on pine needles, and the way the cold made sound carry farther. It reached the creek without rippling the water. It reached the creek without rustling the branches. It didn't warm. It didn't cool. It simply noticed. A fence line appeared near the edge of the next rise. Old, partial, half swallowed by snow and years. The posts leaned. One had broken near the base and now rested at an angle, its wire trailing like thread in the wind. A bird had perched there earlier. Its print was still visible in the snow beneath. Beyond the fence, the world turned flat again. Flat and wide and soft. No buildings, no markers, just a series of distant silhouettes. Hills, maybe. Or clouds that hadn't decided whether to rise or stay near the ground. The stars watched over them, unchanged. Nothing moved here, and still everything shifted just a little. The snow settled a fraction. The wind touched a tree and left a branch trembling. A shadow slid across the ground. As the moon changed its angle, there were no footsteps to follow, no path to return by. But if you stood still enough, you could feel where the light had gone. Not outward, just everywhere. And behind it, all the things it touched stayed warm a little longer. The cabin, the fire, the coat on the bed, the pillow, the match on the step. Allow the feather in the stump. None of them asked for light, but none of them turned away from it. The stars blinked once more, not in signal, not in code, just to remind the sky that it was alive, and the snow, still undisturbed, held its breath